Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is a program designed to bring you news, views, discussion and analysis of religious liberty events in the US and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty magazine, and my guest on this program again is Dr. John Reeve from Andrews University, Church History Department. Let's talk about churches, but today, not ancient history.
Okay.
You know, we live in a wild and wonderful world, and as it's been said by many people correctly, this is sort of global community nowadays.
Sure. Global village.
Global village. Well, the village is getting into a dangerous direction because there are people that reject a globalism. They don't like globalism, and, you know, that's their right. We don't want to break down real identities all in the name of globalism. But in reality, communication and so on has meant that we're a global community, and we do interact. And on religious liberty, there is interaction between religions on a level that I don't think has ever been seen before.
Sure.
In the past, interactions between religion might have been the Crusades going and putting to the sword and another religious viewpoint. Not good. And in a way, it's happening again. But we have an ability or a call, I think, to work together with other religions, not to create syncretism, but we have to create a working arrangement both to interact and to coexist and to, I believe, protect the principle of religious liberty. Well, How can we do that as Christians? And you're free to bring in the church history. You know, has it been that good in the past? Have Christians always, or Christian nations, Christian communities, led the way on this?
Well, actually, no. Christianity was very interested in freedom of Christianity.
Yes.
But was often not interested in freedom of religion. And the distinction is very important. Do I value my ability to worship God the way I want to, or do I value the ability of humans to worship God the way any way they want to? So it is subjective versus generalized to the recognition that if I'm going to have my freedom, I really should be providing you with your freedom as well. That part was not...
And you stated it very well. The way I comment on a lot of what's happening in the United States in particular, a lot of talk of religion, and with a certain faction now in the ascendancy, I see them going for religious entitlement. And I haven't mentioned it before, but I think there's a danger in the US at least that the Islamic community are pushing for the same thing, religious entitlement.
Well, they've certainly pushed for it in other portions of the world.
Right.
Where you have...
and so they're falling into the same era that Christianity did. So in that regard,
yeah,
I certainly don't think I'm picking on them, but I see this dynamic playing out, not just in Christianity. Islam is certainly often aggressively pushing for entitlement, but I think it's a human weakness, and many faith groups have exemplified it, but it's not good.
No.
Not for the others.
No, and in this way, I have often argued that in the main, religions that do that are fallen religions. They have really given up on the idea of what a religion is for, and are now trying to protect the boundaries of their own group. And so they've ceased to be primarily religion and are now just a people group that is insisting on their own way. And at some level, that's anti-religious.
Yes, that's a good point. But it does come naturally to human beings with, in the past, tribal identities, yeah, a closed community. And ironically, I see in this era of globalism, it's sort of precipitating tribalism again.
Well, sure. And the
as a reaction to the other coming at them from all directions.
Well, and part of this has to do with pure numbers. When Christians were a tiny minority in the Roman Empire, they were struggling for the right to be ignored.
Yeah.
Later, when they were a large minority, they were struggling for the right to do what they wanted to do in public sphere. And then later, when they were the majority, they were struggling for the right to dictate what the public sphere ought to be. So if they were right here, and right here in what they were doing, then shouldn't that be right for everyone else? So now the concern was not so much how do we get freedom for everybody to worship as they want, or as much as how do we get freedom for us to worship as we want, and how do we get the ability or the power or the authority to instruct, quote unquote, instruct others to be like us.
Yeah, you made a good point, and I've never heard it said that way, but you're right on, that early Christianity was wanting to be ignored.
Of course.
On a certain level, they were evangelizing.
Because the opposite of ignoring is paying attention to, and when Rome paid attention to things, they tended to squish them.
But it explains, it's a neat explanation of what I've pointed out, and I'm diverting a bit from our general topic, but you know, in America today particularly, Canada a little bit, and Australia too, all the Western countries, but in America particularly, there's this massive debate between Christian sensibility and the state allowance now on gay behavior and gay marriage in particular. And it's come to a head with the Supreme Court action not too long ago on making a determination in the cake case. You know, can a Christian be forced to bake a cake for a gay couple? And he, you know, they upheld his right for now, but it was a narrow decision. But my point is, you know, while you don't want Christians or anyone else forced to act against their faith, that this is turning the world on its head, because I see no evidence in the early Christian church that they were trying to exclude the Romans for homosexuality or any other of a whole basket of pagan practices or whatever. They were trying to be ignored.
Yes.
They would not make a big case if they're a Christian shopkeeper. No, we won't deal with you. You're a worshiper of Zeus or whatever, or you're a temple prostitute, or no. They were functioning with them as someone that was trying to be a good citizen and exemplifying Christian graces, but not holding, you know, a moral test on all their contacts. And it's hard to explain, but I really think we're in danger of turning Christian into an aggressive public condemnation of the non-believer by under the name of religious liberty saying, no, I must have the right to exclude you.
Yeah. Ramsay MacMullen makes a good point. He argues that when Christianity took over from Rome, Christianity changed more than Rome did.
Yeah.
And what he means by that is Christianity, as it grew up in Roman environs, took on the characteristics of the Roman Empire. And so when you have the Justinian Christian Roman Empire enshrined in Roman law now, in the big rewriting of all of Roman law as a Christian empire by Justinian in the 6th century is characteristic of that. They have become Rome. And they have become Rome now. They're the ones who say nobody else can worship any other way. Back here, Rome is saying everybody can worship however they want as long as they pay attention publicly and officially to the emperor and Jupiter. But then once you get to the Christian situation, it's like everybody must do as we do or else.
Yeah.
And that transition, that's imperial power. So were we supposed to evangelize everybody? Yes. Were we supposed to become the majority? Certainly. Why not? Would we, as the majority, then become the persecuting power? No, that was never intended.
It happened.
But it happened.
Yeah.
It happened.
You're giving me an opportunity to ask you this, about something else that has religious liberty ramifications. I understand in the early Christian church under Rome, before Constantine, that when a soldier joined the Christian community, they asked him to give up his soldiering.
Well, that obviously wasn't universal, because you have all kinds of soldiers that are Christian. There's during the Decian persecution, you've got the famous story about the soldiers that were Christian were to be killed, and it's quite a number of them.
It's true. I do remember that. Yeah, there was a problem. Well, maybe it was for a little while in the very earliest part. I had read it that maybe it wasn't an edict, it was just an encouragement. They saw an incompatibility
Well,
between...
even if it was an edict, it wouldn't be universal because there was no universal church.
No, that's true.
The reality that Christianity grew up as a bunch of disparate pieces that eventually congealed around the Roman understanding of this is a historical reality.
Right, and then of course even to this day, Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholicism, so even the Roman thread was cut
Well, sure.
between the two.
Sure. Only because Rome was insisting on being the only thread.
Yeah, yeah. No, church history is very interesting, and I must admit, just as a matter of history, when I look at the Roman Catholic Church, which has every right to exist, under religious liberty rubric, I can't object whatever they believe or however they came to be, but just looked at it as a historical creature. I know that this is basically the shadow of the Roman Empire still with us.
Yeah.
And it's not just religion, it's dragged bits of everything with it.
Sure.
It's really the leftover of the Roman Empire. And they're stuck with it.
And they even called it the Holy Roman Empire.
The joke, neither holy nor Roman.
That's right.
Because it really was based in the Germanic
Sure,
areas.
But
it was an attempt to continue the empire. Right?
Correct. And of course all the different Third Reichs that have popped up through history are also trying to get the mantle of Rome.
Yeah.
Just trying to get the power, but twist it to our own ends now. But the power is what everybody's after.
As you know, the Seventh-day Adventists inherited the Puritan interest in Daniel 2. Mm-hmm. Like in the Civil War, the Fifth Monarchy men were all fixated on that image. But when I look at history today, I still believe that the world as a whole hasn't reformulated itself adequately after the demise of the Roman Empire. And the image of Daniel 2, I think, visualizes that very well. Mixture of iron and of clay, the leftover Roman Empire, it's still sort of got its tentacles through the world order, and we haven't really passed on to anything else.
Well, it's not without reason that the state buildings of America
I was going to say
are
that.
Romanesque.
You noticed it? I mean, it's fine. And
the Jeffersonian architecture was based on the classical world.
I made a comment to someone in Washington once, and I said, it just shows what a Greco-Roman fascination will do to you. But it was done legitimately because that was of Rome in particular, the last great empire, and they consciously were trying to establish the U.S. as the new Rome.
Right.
I don't think it's happened, nor should it happen, because Rome was a different sort of an empire, and it was very cruel by and large, even though the cruelty enabled them to have wonderful road systems and so on.
But ironically, Rome was almost always motivated by the power, yes, but by the money and the power. Now, was it the money for the power, or was it the power for the money? That's up for grabs. But all the laws are always focusing in on how do we get the benefit of commerce.
Well, it wasn't quite capitalistic, but it was monetistic. And the parallel that I would draw, though, I don't believe that it's a good parallel between the U.S. and the Roman Empire. I mean, there's always some parallels to be drawn, but I think the U.S. parallel is to Venice, the trading empire.
Could very well be. Yeah.
We'll take a short break. We'll be back to continue this very interesting discussion. Welcome back to Liberty Insider. Before the break, with my guest, we were. Well, you tell us where we were. We'd gone uphill and down dale, but from the point of view of the early Christian church, and of course how religious liberty and the individual relates to some of those developments.
But showing how we go from Christianity trying to be ignored so that they can have their freedom.
Yeah, I love that point.
To Christianity trying to cooperate and be a part of the system in the public sphere, to where by the time you get to Justinian's Christian empire, Rome has become Christianity. Christianity has become Rome. And of course, Christianity changed more than Rome did. And so you end up with a state that is claiming universal authority based on God's will, and then enforceable because it was based on God's will. And religious freedom was not part of that economy.
We had a little discussion about empires, and of course the United States has been called a modern empire. But in what regard do you think that it radically differs from Christianity under the Roman Empire, which merged into one and the same?
Well, ironically, the United States develops as a nation first, and the envelopment of being a Christian nation is actually an undercurrent, and throughout time, but it's always an undercurrent. The big thing is freedom. And so freedom and religious freedom go hand in hand. So America, United States, is intending to provide religious freedom over and against that which was not religious freedom in the European nations. And so it has a complete different history. Christianity was not developed in order to create religious freedom. Christianity was not developed as a nation. It became an empire. But that's not what it started as, nor what it required.
I've thought long and hard, why has the American experience been so different from the old world? Because religion played a huge role in the different settlements in this continent. And I don't know that there's any definitive answer. I think one key thing I've just not read about it much, but the Church of England, which was the established church of England, and was strong in the United States, of course backed the Crown in the War of Independence. And so America began its national life as a republic with the most important church discredited and seen as the ultimate other.
Right.
And even to this day, that's why it's called the Episcopal Church of the United States.
Right.
It doesn't sort of fly very well,
No.
Anglican or Church of England.
Yeah.
And so the back was broken of an established, not so much, well, it was an established, but a politically powerful church. And what was left was a patchwork quilt. And when I look at the American history that way, it seems to me it's had, in very small microcosm, all of the problems of the old world, but so balkanized and on such a smaller level that it really didn't affect the whole the same way.
And the nation develops as disparate groups trying to hold on to the things they shared.
Yes.
And that's a very big difference between that and Christianity.
Well, the infusion of the whole Enlightenment concept of moral independence and that we're autonomous beings and so on. It's a horrible admission to make as a Christian, but I think given that Christianity with the Roman Empire had devolved to such a level, we needed this infusion of secular self-determination to sort of break the spell, even though godless self-determination is what Satan was pushing in the garden.
Yes, but in some ways, a true view of Christian freedom is actually reflected in that humanistic freedom.
Yeah, almost inadvertently. You're right. Nature and nature's God.
Right. So you end up with the religious dynamic, even though some are trying to completely get rid of that religious dynamic.
Well, even as you say that, I'm thinking about Lord Byron in his Manfred poem. He says in Rome, at midnight he looked in the ruins and all the rest. He says, and until the whole thing became religion. So secularism, almost taken to the limit, becomes a religion. I don't really buy into the idea that is often said that secularism in the US should be managed and recognized as a religion. I don't think that's quite right. It makes no claims that way, even if people behave toward a secular agenda like a religious person does.
But why is it treated that way here? Because it's viewed as a tribe. And tribes have religious autonomy, and they're protecting their religious views. And even those that are anti-religious, that is viewed by the larger group as a religious viewpoint.
Yeah. Well, in that regard,
because of tribalism.
Yes. Yeah. So, again, this movable feast, and it's interesting to discuss in the U.S. how all these ancient influences came together, and yet to really truly enable religious liberty at the best times, but as always an aspirational view that wasn't shared in previous ages. I can't remember Rome ever, well, it did some good things, but it never made these grand statements of all men are free and all this. Quite the contrary.
No.
As the New World was settled, the Pope determined at one point they're not even human beings.
Yeah, yeah.
So the US, I think, has fulfilled a wonderfully enabling role of holding up a great ideal, not always living up to it, but it's an ideal that's facilitated religious freedom and civil liberties in a way that the old states and the old religious entities weren't able to do.
So why is it collapsing in now?
That's the question. Viewers, no, we need to discuss that.
Well,
it is collapsing in.
It
You're
is
right.
collapsing in. The attitude of people is, we need freedom for me, not for you. It's tribalism again asserting itself. So the very thing that's causing the great religions of the world, Hinduism, is now turning to having a Hindu state. Many of the Islamic nations are saying now we are going to be Islamic nations and have Islamic law in our nations. And there's this great pull within the few Christian nations that are still Christian enough to have mostly church-going Christians in them to say we must become a Christian state. Yeah. Is that a loss or is that a gain?
Well, we can analyze this at great length. What I think is going on, ironically, in this age of communications, there's less personal knowledge of the different faiths that people subscribe to. So they're not informed about their own faith, and their reaction that you describe is because they perceive a threat to their identity. This is the great thing about globalism is threatening to most groups. They feel that they'll be sort of bled away into a larger whole, and they don't want that. Yeah. So you have a threat and then an ignorance about who you are, and it gets toxic very quickly, I think.
But what is it?
The Bible says, my people perish for lack of knowledge.
Sure.
Lack of knowledge is a pretty dangerous situation to be in.
Yeah, especially if you're holding on to your identity, even though you don't actually believe it anymore.
And, two examples you gave, the Hindu nationalists, they feel threatened. With some justification. There's a large Muslim minority in India, and they're on the border of a radical state that's never gotten over partition. And here, two nuclear states, I believe very likely before the end of time, they'll have a shot at each other. Three times in my lifetime they've gone to war. And then you cite Islam. The Islamic world is under threat, or at least in the Middle East.
Sure.
It's an open fact that the US, some policy planners beyond a given administration, they have an agenda to remake the map there. It's basically the Sykes-Picot era all over again. I'm referring to the British and the French foreign ministers who divvied up the Middle East. There is an inclination, sharpened by declining resources of oil in other parts of the world, to move in and so Islam is not totally wrong to think that in a political sense, at least, their home base is under threat. And religious groups that are not self-assured about what they believe and who they are, then come under some threat. Not good. And Christianity is not immune to this.
No, and in the context of tribalism, the idea that we are right because we are, as opposed to there's rational reasons or spiritual reasons, or it's God-ordained reasons, not thoughtfully thought out reasons or chosen reasons. So you end up with, we are who we are, and we should be allowed to remain who we are, even if it means we have to dominate everyone else to do that.
Yeah. But we do have to pray and hope and work toward increasing a knowledge and an understanding of the rights of others that can sort of diffuse this protective, antagonistic element in the world today, don't you think?
The reality is that if I'm not willing to give freedom to somebody else, religious freedom to somebody else, I don't end up with any religious freedom myself.
In one of his lectures, C.S. Lewis commented on a revolutionary that he could imagine who had murdered people, overturned society, done all sorts of murder and mayhem, all in the goal of establishing his idea of a perfect society. But in the face of God's judgment, we recognize that it was futile. In our day, I'm sure, similarly, that a group like ISIS, murderous and destructive to the limit, if they could see, as they will one day, how futile and murderous that really was, would be surely very disappointed. But we need to recognize that many efforts have come and gone to establish the kingdom of God on earth, an ideal kingdom, that all of them are destined for failure without recognizing that it's in the heart of free will that truth is established, not by force, and that God's kingdom is a spiritual reality now. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.